The colonel's face underwent a series of subtle transformations. First indignation, then confusion, and finally a sort of resigned comprehension, as though he had just realized that inviting Peter Wimsey to examine a broken teacup was rather like inviting a master locksmith to have a look at one's front door and then expressing surprise when he began asking questions about the hinges. "Enemies?" he repeated, with the genuine bewilderment of a man whose life had been conducted with such relentless propriety that the notion of harboring an actual adversary seemed almost architecturally impossible. "My dear Wimsey, I'm a retired soldier. I keep to myself. I have my club, my garden, my wife's social engagements. I cannot imagine—" "No," Peter said gently, "I rather think you cannot. Which is precisely why I am here, and precisely why we shall now have tea with Mrs. Ashford and conduct, what I trust, will be an illuminating conversation about household arrangements, domestic staff, and the movements of various persons throughout this manor during the pertinent hours." He rose from the settee with the languid grace of a man for whom standing represented a minor but manageable inconvenience, and straightened his waistcoat with the precision of someone arranging a piece in a particularly complex puzzle. "The tea will be provided, I assume, in cups from a different service? I should prefer not to create further statistical complications." Eleanor Ashford proved to be a woman of approximately 60 years, with the sort of faded blonde hair that spoke of careful maintenance and iron determination, and with eyes that held the particular clarity of an individual who had spent 3 decades engaged in the systematic organization of domestic life. She received Peter with the stiffness of a woman who had been told that the family mystery was being investigated by a man whose reputation involved not only the solving of crimes, but also the occasional comments about one's personal habits made in a manner that suggested profound amusement at one's expense. They took tea from the everyday service, mercifully, in the morning room, and Peter began his interrogation with the sort of innocent curiosity that had, over the years, caused more than one criminal to lower their guard and commit precisely the indiscretion that would lead to their undoing. "The ritual," he said, accepting a cup with a smile of such charm that Mrs. Ashford found herself unable to maintain her defensive posture, "the annual washing. How long has this been performed?" 30 years, Mrs. Ashford said promptly, "since the day we received the set. I've always believed that regular, proper maintenance preserves the value of fine things. One cannot simply leave such items to dust and neglect. Naturally not. And you wash them yourself, I understand, rather than entrusting them to the servants. A matter of trust or of expertise?" "Both," Mrs. Ashford replied, with a tightness about the lips that suggested she considered the matter one of considerable importance. "My housemaid, Martha, is conscientious, but she lacks the necessary delicacy for items of such value. Porcelain of this quality requires a particular touch." Peter sipped his tea thoughtfully, as though considering the philosophical implications of this statement. "And yesterday morning, when you removed the set from the cabinet, the locked cabinet, I should note, did you happen to observe anything unusual? Any indication that the cabinet had been tampered with, or that the arrangement of the cups and saucers had been disturbed?" "Certainly not," Mrs. Ashford said, but there was the faintest hesitation before the word, barely perceptible but present nonetheless. Peter, whose ear for such minute variations was rather like that of a conductor detecting a single instrument slightly out of tune within a full orchestra, leaned forward with renewed interest. "You hesitated," he observed, not unkindly, "which suggests that either something was unusual or you are aware that something should have been unusual but was not. Which is it?" Mrs. Ashford set down her teacup with a precision that spoke of considerable effort. "The cabinet," she said slowly, "was not locked yesterday morning. That is to say, it was locked, but the key was not where it ought to have been. I keep it on a small shelf in my dressing room, behind a porcelain figurine. When I went to retrieve it yesterday, the figurine had been moved, only slightly." "But I noticed." "And did you mention this to your husband?" Peter asked. "No," Mrs. Ashford admitted. "I assumed I had simply moved it myself and forgotten. I am not so young as I once was. One forgets such small things." "On the contrary," Peter said, "you have just demonstrated that you forget nothing of the sort. Your mind is of the sort that would notice a misplaced figurine immediately and recall it with perfect accuracy months hence. Which brings us to the rather pressing question of who, precisely, had access to your dressing room, and when they might have made use of that access. The room fell into silence, broken only by the sound of the fire settling in the grate. Outside, the afternoon light had begun its descent toward darkness, and somewhere in the house, Peter noted with the part of his mind that was always attending to peripheral details, a clock began to chime the hour. It was a Baroque melody, unfamiliar and slightly discordant, and he made a mental note to inquire about its source. Mrs. Ashford's hands trembled slightly as she ched for her teacup, and when she spoke, her voice had taken on the quality of someone confessing something she had hoped never to articulate. "My niece," she said quietly, "Victoria. She arrived 3 days ago and has been staying in the guest room. She has access to the corridor outside my dressing room. But surely you cannot think Victoria is family. She is practically a daughter to us. She would never—" "Wouldn't she?" Peter asked, and in his voice there was no judgment, only a kind of terrible, dispassionate curiosity. "Tell me, Mrs. Ashford, when was the last time you actually saw Victoria before she arrived here?" Mrs. Ashford's composure, which had been maintained with considerable effort throughout the preceding conversation, underwent a subtle but unmistakable deterioration at this question. She set down her teacup with a sound that was marginally louder than necessary, and her fingers clasped together in her lap with the intensity of someone gripping the edge of a precipice. "Victoria," she said, and the word emerged as though it required translation from some foreign language of emotion that she had never quite mastered. Well, it must have been at least 2 years, perhaps longer. She was living abroad, you understand. Paris, initially, and then, well, the circumstances became somewhat complicated, and we lost touch for a period." Peter's eyebrow rose with the precision of a drawbridge opening, and he regarded Mrs. Ashford with an expression of such focused attention that she found herself unable to maintain eye contact. "Lost touch," he repeated, with a tone that suggested he was repeating a phrase in a language he had never actually encountered before. A curious phrase for a beloved niece. One might say that one loses touch with distant cousins, or with school friends who have drifted into different circles, but practically a daughter figure would seem more difficult to misplace. Unless, of course, the estrangement was deliberate on her part, or indeed on yours. "It was," Mrs. Ashford began, and then stopped, her mouth closing with the snap of a trap. Peter waited, with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that silence was far more effective than any question in prompting confession. The Colonel, who had been sitting in an armchair by the window with the expression of someone watching a play in a language he did not entirely understand, shifted uncomfortably. "Eleanor," he said, with a note of inquiry that suggested he too had been kept in the dark regarding certain aspects of his wife's family history. "What is Whimsy getting at? Victoria is your sister's girl. Surely you've kept correspondence?" Mrs. Ashford rose to her feet with an abruptness that spoke of desperation masquerading as dignity. "If you must know," she said, her voice now carrying an edge that had not been present before, "Victoria had become involved in certain pursuits that I found incompatible with the standards of this household. My sister had passed some years before, and I felt it my duty to attempt to guide the girl toward a more respectable course. When she refused to heed my advice, I made it clear that she would not be welcome here until such time as she amended her behavior. We exchanged no letters, there were no Christmas cards. It was a matter of principle." Peter rose as well, moving to the window with the unhurried grace of a man who had all the time in the world, though his eyes, when he turned back to regard Mrs. Ashford, held the brightness of someone whose interest had been considerably piqued. "And 3 days ago, this errant niece, whom you had not seen or heard from in 2 years or more, simply arrived on your doorstep? Unannounced, I presume?" "She sent a telegram," Mrs. Ashford said reluctantly, "the day before, saying that she wished to reconcile, that she had reformed her ways, that she hoped we might find it in ourselves to forgive her. The Colonel insisted that we respond generously. He said that family was family, and that I was being uncharitable. The Colonel, thus implicated in the business of familial sentimentality, had the grace to look somewhat sheepish, but he did not contradict his wife's account. Peter moved to the mantelpiece and examined, with apparent interest, a collection of photographs that documented the Ashfords' social history over 3 decades: wedding portraits, garden parties, formal gatherings at which everyone appeared to be suffering from a collective constipation of the spirit. Among them was a photograph, somewhat faded, of a young woman of perhaps 25, with dark hair and eyes that possessed a quality of intelligent defiance that set her apart from the other images in the collection. "Victoria," Peter said, and it was not a question. Mrs. Ashford nodded mutely. "How long precisely has she been here?" Peter continued, picking up the photograph and studying it with the intensity of a man conducting some form of internal calculation. 3 days, you said. That would place her arrival on Saturday, I should think. And the breaking of the saucer occurred yesterday morning, during the ritual washing, which suggests that if Victoria did indeed have access to your dressing room key on Saturday or Sunday, she had ample opportunity to arrange whatever it is she intended to arrange. But I cannot imagine what she would want with a broken saucer, Mrs. Ashford protested, though her voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. It's scarcely valuable. A crack renders it worthless, surely. Peter turned from the mantelpiece, the photograph still in his hand, and smiled a smile that was not entirely pleasant. "On the contrary," he said softly, "a rack in a saucer, Mrs. Ashford, may be worth considerably more than an intact one, depending, of course, on one's perspective. Where is Victoria at present?" "In her room," the Colonel said, checking his pocket watch, "resting. She said the journey had fatigued her considerably." "How convenient," Peter murmured. "I should like to meet this reformed and reconciled niece. But first, if you would not object, I should very much like to examine the china cabinet, the key that was moved, and more particularly, I should like to speak with your housemaid, Martha. I suspect she has rather more to tell us about Victoria's movements than anyone has yet realized." The china cabinet proved to be precisely as Mrs. Ashford had described it, a mahogany affair of considerable solidity, with a lock that was neither particularly sophisticated nor particularly modern, and with a key that, when produced from behind a porcelain figurine in Mrs. Ashford's dressing room, was entirely unremarkable save for the fact that it had clearly been removed and replaced with such care that only a woman of Mrs. Ashford's obsessive attention to detail would have noticed the disturbance. Peter examined both lock and key with the meticulous attention of an archaeologist studying artifacts of profound historical significance, though, in truth, he seemed more interested in the dust patterns around the figurine than in the mechanisms of security themselves. "The figurine," he said, turning it over in his hands, "has been moved recently, within the past few days, certainly. There is a slight discoloration where it has been shifted, exposing the wood beneath to light, and yet the dust around it suggests that no one has cleaned this shelf in, what would you estimate, Mrs. Ashford? A week? 2 weeks? The housemaid cleans on Thursdays," Mrs. Ashford said, her voice now carrying the flat quality of someone who's a Lucy. "Ons were undergoing systematic dismantlement. That would have been 9 days ago." Peter set the figurine down with infinite care and turned toward the door. "Then we shall have a word with Martha. Where might we find her at this hour?" The servants' quarters were located, as was customary in a house of this size, in the basement wing, and it was there that they discovered Martha engaged in the process of polishing silver with the concentrated ferocity of someone for whom labor was both a solace and a religion. She was perhaps 40, with the kind of face that comes from years of service in households where invisibility was a professional requirement. Not homely precisely, but remarkable chiefly for its complete absence of remarkable qualities. She rose at their approach with the automaticity of a woman who had spent 2 decades responding to the movements of her employers with the precision of a mechanical doll. "Martha," Peter said, with a warmth that seemed to surprise her into something approaching comfort, "I wonder if you might spare a few moments to assist me with a small matter. Nothing of consequence, you understand. Merely a question of domestic arrangements." Martha's eyes darted toward Mrs. Ashford with the wariness of a creature who had learned to fear the seemingly innocent questions of the gentry, but Peter gestured for her to sit, and after a moment's hesitation, she complied. "Tell me," Peter continued, settling himself into a chair with the ease of a man for whom class distinctions were merely one more tedious convention to be navigated. "When Miss Victoria arrived on Saturday, did you assist with her luggage?" "Yes, sir," Martha said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned never to volunteer information beyond what was directly requested. "Heavy, was it?" Peter inquired with apparent interest. "Her luggage, I mean." "Full. L of Paris fashions, I should imagine. Young ladies do tend to accumulate an extraordinary amount of impedimenta when traveling." "There were 2 cases," Martha said slowly. "One for clothing, I should think. The other seemed rather heavy for clothing, sir. Heavier, anyway. It clinked a bit when it was moved." Peter's eyes brightened with the intensity of a man who had just heard precisely the detail he had been waiting for. "Clinked, you say? Interesting. And where was this second case placed? In Miss Victoria's room, I presume?" "In her room, yes, sir, though she didn't want me to help unpack it. Very particular about it, she was. Said she would manage it herself." "How very independent of her," Peter observed. "And since her arrival, have you noticed her moving about the house at unusual hours? Late at night, perhaps, or early in the morning?" Martha's fingers twisted together, and Peter noticed with interest that her knuckles had gone white with the effort of containing whatever it was she wished to say, but was afraid to articulate. "There have been sounds," Martha admitted finally, as though the words were being drawn from her against her will. "In the night. Footsteps in the hallway, and once I heard the sound of something being moved in the drawing room, though when I investigated, there was nothing disturbed." "What night was this?" Peter asked gently. "Saturday night? Sunday night?" "Sunday night, sir, very late. Or very early, rather. The clock in the hall was striking 2 when I heard it." Peter rose to his feet with a decisiveness that suggested a chess player who had just perceived the winning move several moves hence. He thanked Martha with a courtesy that seemed to fluster her considerably, and then turned to Mrs. Ashford with an expression that was neither unkind nor particularly reassuring. "I believe," he said, "that we should now have that conversa. Ton with Miss Victoria. But before we do, I should very much like to examine the contents of her room, particularly that second case. I assume she has not locked the door." Mrs. Ashford, who appeared to be undergoing the peculiar experience of watching her entire understanding of her household and her family being systematically dismantled by a man in an expensive waistcoat who spoke as though discussing the weather, could only shake her head mutely. The colonel, who had followed them downstairs, with the air of a man drawn inexorably toward a disaster he could neither prevent nor fully comprehend, placed a protective hand on his wife's shoulder. "Now, see here, Whimsy," he said, with the authority of a man accustomed to command. "We cannot simply search the girl's room without her permission. It's not done. It's not—" "Gentlemanly?" Peter interrupted, with a smile that held no judgment. "No, Colonel, it is not gentlemanly. But then neither is breaking into a locked cabinet and moving a key, nor is arriving unannounced at the home of relatives one has deliberately estranged to engage in, and I think we shall find this confirmed, activities considerably more nefarious than mere youthful indiscretion. Shall we proceed? I promise you the truth, however uncomfortable, is invariably preferable to the luxury of sustained ignorance." Victoria Ashford's room was located on the 2nd floor, in what had clearly been designated as the guest wing, a space designed to be comfortable without being welcoming, pleasant without being intimate. The furnishings were of the sort one might find in a superior hotel, tasteful, impersonal, and entirely devoid of the accumulated detritus that marks a genuine residence. The second case sat beneath the window, partially concealed behind the chintz curtains, and it was immediately apparent that this was not a piece of luggage intended for the transport of clothing. It was larger, heavier, and constructed of reinforced wood with metal bindings, the sort of container one might use for the transport of valuable items, or, Peter reflected with a certain grim satisfaction, for items one wished to keep secret from casual inspection. The lock was neither locked nor particularly sophisticated, and when Peter opened it, the contents proved to be precisely what he had anticipated, a collection of what appeared to be porcelain pieces, each wrapped with considerable care in cloth and straw, each representing, he suspected, a rather significant monetary value. There were teacups, saucers, plates and bowls, all of them bearing the distinctive marks of Wedgwood, all of them of considerable age and obvious quality, and all of them, Peter noted with interest, arranged with the precision of someone engaged in systematic acquisition. "My God," the colonel breathed, leaning over Peter's shoulder with the expression of a man watching his entire understanding of propriety collapse. "She's been stealing. Victoria has been. Eleanor, these must be. Worth a considerable sum," Peter finished, holding up a delicate teacup to the light. 18th century, if I am not mistaken. And note the arrangement, Colonel, not haphazard, not the result of opportunistic theft, but systematic, methodical. These are pieces from a collection that your niece has been acquiring piece by piece, perhaps over months, perhaps longer. Mrs. Ashford had entered the room behind them, and her face had taken on the pallor of a woman who had just discovered that the moral universe operated according to principles entirely different from those she had always assumed. "But why?" she whispered. "Why would she? We have money. We have always been willing to help." If she had simply asked— "Ah," Peter said, straightening from his examination of the case with a movement. "That was entirely theatrical, but that is the question that interests me most profoundly. Miss Victoria Ashford arrives unannounced after a 2-year estrangement, sends a telegram of reconciliation, and immediately sets about not merely visiting you, but conducting a systematic examination of your valuables. And she does so with such care, such planning, that she takes the time to move your dressing-room key, to prowl about the house at 2 in the morning, and to arrange for the breaking of a saucer, I might note, from a service that she clearly knew to be valuable. Why break a saucer that one intends to steal?" Peter moved to the window and looked out across the darkening grounds of Ashford Manor, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture of contemplation. Unless, of course, the breaking of the saucer was not the crime. Unless it was, in fact, something considerably more elaborate, a distraction, perhaps, a means of drawing attention to one matter while another, more significant matter, proceeded unnoticed. He turned back to face the Ashfords, and in his expression there was something that might have been pity, or might have been contempt, or might have been some more complex admixture of both. "Tell me, Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly, "did you not find it odd that your niece would arrive with luggage such as this? That a young woman, arriving to reconcile with estranged relatives, would bring with her what is, quite clearly, the portable contents of a rather successful enterprise in art theft?" Mrs. Ashford opened her mouth and closed it again, and Peter continued without waiting for a response. "I suspect that Miss Victoria has been engaged in acquiring Wedgwood for some time. Pieces here, pieces there, from antique dealers, from private collections, from the homes of people sufficiently wealthy and sufficiently careless to not immediately notice their absence, and I suspect that she has done so in service to someone else. Someone who has been collecting these pieces with a very specific goal in mind." He gestured toward the open case. "These are not random acquisitions, you see. They are all of the same period, the same pattern group, the same, if one examines them carefully, family. This is not a collection being assembled for profit. This is a collection being assembled for completion." The colonel stared at him with the bewilderment of a man listening to a foreign language that happened, irritatingly, to use words that he recognized. "Completion? Whimsy? What in blazes are you talking about? What does any of this have to do with a broken saucer?" "Everything," Peter said simply, "and nothing. The saucer is both entirely relevant and entirely irrelevant. It is the key and the lock and the solution all at once, if one approaches it from the correct angle." He moved toward the door with the decisiveness of a man who had just arrived at a conclusion that required immediate action. "I am going to require your cooperation in a small theatrical undertaking. Nothing dramatic, you understand. Merely a simple reenactment of yesterday morning's events. Mrs. Ashford, you will wash the remaining saucers from your wedding service. Carefully, delicately. And whilst you do so, I shall be observing with the most profound attention. And then, I think, we shall know precisely what it is that Miss Victoria intended, and more importantly, why she found it necessary to attempt it at all." The kitchen of Ashford Manor was a space of considerable efficiency, all gleaming copper and pristine surfaces, with an aga that radiated warmth like a benevolent deity of domestic comfort. Mrs. Ashford arranged the remaining saucers from her wedding service in a line upon the working surface with the ceremonial precision of a surgeon preparing instrum. Hence, for an operation of profound delicacy. Peter stood at a distance, observing with the attention of a man for whom the minutiae of human behavior represented the entire landscape of comprehensible truth. The colonel had been persuaded to occupy himself elsewhere. Peter had suggested with great gentleness that his presence would prove distracting, and so it was only Mrs. Ashford, Peter, and the unspoken weight of accumulated deception that filled the room as lukewarm water was drawn, and the first saucer was submerged with infinite care. "Now," Peter said, his voice carrying the tone of a man conducting a tutorial in some arcane but essential discipline, "you would have cleaned each saucer in turn, I presume, following a particular sequence." "Naturally," Mrs. Ashford replied, her movements mechanical, as though she had become separated from her body and was observing it from some distant vantage point. "Always from oldest to newest. It is how my mother taught me. The pieces that have endured the longest deserve the gentlest attention." "How very logical," Peter observed. "And during this process, did you examine each piece closely? Hold it to the light, perhaps? Test its structural integrity in any way?" Mrs. Ashford's hands stilled in the water, and when she continued, her movements had become noticeably more deliberate. Yes. One does, doesn't one? When handling something one values, one feels for imperfections, for signs of weakness. It is instinctive." "Precisely," Peter said, and moved closer to observe the saucer that was currently being washed. "And what would you do if you discovered, whilst examining a saucer, that it possessed a hidden flaw? A weakness that might, under certain conditions, cause it to fracture?" Mrs. Ashford did not answer immediately. Instead, she lifted the saucer from the water and held it up to the light streaming through the kitchen window, rotating it slowly, examining its surface with the intensity of someone searching for evidence of a crime. When she spoke, her voice had become barely above a whisper. "There is something," she said, "inside. On the underside, near the rim, it feels grainy, as though something has been embedded in the glaze." Peter took the saucer from her with the reverence of a man receiving an artifact of incalculable significance, and examined it with the jeweler's loupe that he produced from his pocket with the facility of a conjurer extracting a rabbit from a hat. What he observed caused his eyebrow to rise with dramatic precision, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the tone of a man who had just confirmed a theory that was both utterly logical and utterly damning. "Diamonds," he said simply. "Uncut diamonds, embedded in the glaze of the underside of each saucer. Clever, extraordinarily clever. The diamonds would have been placed in the unfired porcelain before the glaze was applied, rendering them invisible, unless one knew precisely where and how to look. Your wedding service, Mrs. Ashford, is not merely a wedding service. It is a receptacle for a rather significant quantity of uncut diamonds, worth a rather significant quantity of money to anyone who knew of their existence and possessed the knowledge to extract them." Mrs. Ashford sank into a chair with the grace of a marionette whose strings had been suddenly severed. The colonel, who had apparently been unable to resist the temptation to eavesdrop from the corridor and had just entered the kitchen with a transparency that suggested surprise was not among his stronger emotions, made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite an expletive. "But that was done when we received the service," Mrs. Ashford said, her voice now carrying the tone of someone discovering that every assumption upon which he had built her life had been constructed upon foundations of sand. 30 years ago, the service was a gift from my aunt. We opened it together. We examined it. There was nothing. There could not have been." "Your aunt," Peter interrupted gently. "How well did you know her?" We saw her seldom. She traveled a great deal. She had married a man involved in, I believe he was in the gem trade, though we never discussed such matters in detail. She was eccentric. She lived abroad. After her death, there was some scandal. Something about debts, money missing. But it was all handled very discreetly. We did not inquire too closely into family matters of such delicacy. Peter exchanged a glance with the colonel, a glance that conveyed, in the space of a heartbeat, the entire architecture of what had occurred. Your aunt, he said slowly, was not sending you a wedding gift. She was sending you a safe deposit. Diamonds, smuggled through the porcelain, disguised as decoration, embedded in a service that would be handled with such care and preserved with such dedication that they would remain undisturbed for decades. A remarkably elegant solution to the problem of moving contraband across international borders and storing it beyond the reach of anyone seeking to recover it. Mrs. Ashford's face had taken on the appearance of someone who had been struck by a revelation so profound that the normal machinery of comprehension had temporarily ceased to function. Then Victoria, she knew, she came here because, Peter said, with a tone that was almost kind, someone has finally discovered the secret of your aunt's final gift. Someone has learned that the Ashford wedding service contains a rather significant quantity of uncut diamonds, and someone has enlisted your niece, a young woman of considerable intelligence and considerable desperation, to acquire those diamonds and deliver them to an interested party. The breaking of the saucer was not an act of carelessness, Mrs. Ashford. It was Victoria's attempt to extract one of the diamonds without your knowledge, to test whether her hypothesis was correct, and to determine whether you would notice. When you did notice, when you demonstrated your obsessive attention to detail, she was forced to accelerate her timeline considerably. The silence that followed Peter's revelation was the silence of a world that had fundamentally shifted on its axis, leaving everyone within it disoriented and gasping for purchase on solid ground. The colonel had moved to a chair and lowered himself into it, with the careful movements of an elderly man who suspected that standing might no longer be possible, whilst Mrs. Ashford continued to stare at the saucer in Peter's hands as though it had transformed before her eyes into something utterly alien. But if someone has learned the secret, the colonel said finally, his voice emerging in a rasp that suggested considerable effort, then the diamonds are in immediate danger. We must secure them. We must contact the police. We must do nothing of the sort, Peter interrupted, with a mildness that seemed almost cruel in its contrast to the gravity of the situation, at least not immediately. You see, the matter has become considerably more complex than a simple case of theft. The diamonds that your aunt embedded in this service were not her property to gift. They were, I suspect, the proceeds of a rather elaborate scheme, either a theft or something considerably more sinister. The gem trade has always attracted a certain element of unsavory character, and your aunt's husband, if my instincts are correct, was involved in activities that the legitimate jewelry world prefers to regard with studied ignorance. He moved to the window and gazed out at the darkening gardens, where the last light of day was being swallowed by gathering shadows. Your niece Victoria is not the architect of this scheme. She is merely the instrument, a young woman with considerable intelligence and considerable need who has been approached by someone offering her money or safety, or perhaps merely the promise of a way out of whatever circumstances have rendered her desperate enough to return to the family that cast her out. The person who truly wants these diamonds is someone considerably more dangerous, someone who has been searching for them for years perhaps, someone who knows exactly what they represent and what they might be worth on the market for such things. The colonel rose stiffly from his chair. Then we must speak to Victoria immediately. We must do nothing of the sort, Peter said again, turning from the window with an expression that was peculiarly enigmatic. At least, not yet. Because the moment we confront Victoria, we reveal that we know what she is doing, and the moment we reveal that knowledge, we place her in considerably greater danger than she currently occupies. Whoever has enlisted her, whoever has promised her whatever promises were made, will assume that she has failed, and people of that stripe have a tendency to regard failure as a weakness that requires rather permanent remedying. Mrs. Ashford had recovered sufficiently to speak, though her voice remained thin and fragile as old parchment. Then what are we to do? Simply allow her to steal from us? Simply pretend that nothing has occurred? On the contrary, Peter said, settling himself into a chair with the ease of a man for whom comfort had become a secondary concern. We are going to do something considerably more elaborate. We are going to stage a theft. We are going to allow Victoria to believe that she has succeeded in her mission. And we're going to use that success to bring into the open the person or persons who have orchestrated this entire affair." He gestured for Mrs. Ashford to sit as well, though she seemed reluctant to abandon her position by the sink, as though proximity to the sources offered some form of comfort or absolution. "Tell me," Peter continued, "in the 2 years since Victoria's estrangement, has there been any communication from her? Any letters, any messages, any indication of where she was or what she was doing?" "Nothing," Mrs. Ashford said. "We knew only that she was abroad. The Colonel sent inquiries through mutual acquaintances, but nothing came of them. It was as though she had ceased to exist. Then her arrival here was unexpected," Peter said, though it was not truly a question. "No warning beyond the telegram, which arrived how long before she actually appeared?" "One day," the Colonel said. "The telegram arrived Saturday morning. Victoria appeared Saturday afternoon." Peter nodded slowly, his fingers steepled before him in a gesture of deep contemplation. "Then whoever has engaged her, whoever has instructed her to acquire these diamonds, has done so with remarkable speed and precision, which suggests that they have been keeping watch on this household. They have known that an opportunity would present itself. They have been waiting for a moment when Victoria might gain access to the manor and to your private quarters." He rose again and began to pace the kitchen with the movements of a man engaged in the complex mental choreography of solving a puzzle that possessed not merely multiple pieces, but multiple entire puzzles nested within it. The question becomes not merely who wants the diamonds, but why they want them now. Why this sudden urgency? Why the need to engage Victoria and force matters to a crisis point? And the answer, I suspect, lies in something that has occurred in the past few months. Something that has altered the situation and rendered whatever patient scheme was in operation suddenly desperately urgent. He stopped mid-stride and turned to regard the Ashfords with an intensity that suggested a conclusion had just crystallized in his mind. "When did your aunt die?" he asked. 17 years ago, Mrs. Ashford replied. "She left everything to my cousin Gerald, the house, the investments, everything. He has never been particularly forthcoming about her affairs." Peter's smile, when it appeared, was not a smile of amusement, but of grim recognition. "Then I suspect that your cousin Gerald has recently done something that has forced whoever is seeking these diamonds to accelerate their timeline. Either he has died, or he is dying, or he has discovered the truth about his inheritance and has taken steps to prevent access to it. Either way, the window of opportunity is closing. And Victoria, poor, desperate Victoria, has become a pawn in a game far more dangerous than she understands." The telephone call to the London residence of Gerald Ashford Hayes, for such it emerged was the full name of Mrs. Ashford's cousin, took place from the Colonel's study, a room that smelled of tobacco and old books and the particular mustiness of masculine solitude. Peter, having commandeered the instrument with the ease of a man accustomed to assuming command of such matters, conducted the conversation with a courtesy that barely concealed the surgical precision of his inquiry. He began, innocuously enough, with expressions of distant familial concern, progressed smoothly to inquiries about health and recent travels, and then, with the dexterity of a conjurer, executing a particularly complex sleight of hand, shifted the conversation toward the matter of family heirlooms and the disposition of certain valuable items of sentimental significance. What emerged from this conversation, conducted entirely in the affable tones of one gentleman speaking to another, was that Gerald Ashford Hayes was not merely alive, but in robust if irascible health, and that he had, in fact, recently initiated the process of cataloguing his mother's extensive collection of decorative arts with a view toward eventually donating a substantial portion of it to the Victoria and Albert Museum. More significantly, he had begun inquiries into the provenance of certain items, particularly those of foreign origin, and had expressed considerable concern regarding the legal and ethical complications that might arise should any of those items prove to have questionable histories. When Peter replaced the telephone receiver, the colonel immediately rose from his chair with the eagerness of a man who believed himself on the verge of understanding something that had, until moments before, remained opaque. "Then it is Gerald," the colonel said. "He has discovered something about the diamonds. He has begun to investigate, and someone who has a claim on those stones, has learned that he is doing so." "Precisely," Peter said, though his expression suggested that the truth was considerably more nuanced than such a simple formulation would allow, "though I suspect that Gerald himself does not yet realize the true nature of what he possesses. He believes that he is merely investigating the provenance of his mother's collection. He does not yet understand that one particular item in that collection is a repository for a fortune in uncut diamonds. Nor does he understand that there are individuals of considerable power and considerably less scruple who would regard the seizure of those stones as entirely justified, indeed, as an act of restitution." Peter moved to the window and gazed out into the darkness that had now completely swallowed the G. Ardens of Ashford Manor. The house had taken on that particular quality that houses possess when they become aware that something has shifted within their walls, a kind of attentive silence, as though the very structure was listening to the conversations conducted within it. "The question now becomes one of timing and orchestration," Peter continued. "Someone has learned that Gerald is investigating his mother's collection. Someone has learned, or suspected, or perhaps always known, that the diamonds are hidden within the Wedgwood service. And someone has decided that rather than attempting to breach Gerald's defenses, for presumably a man of his station would have security measures in place, it would be considerably simpler to approach a young woman of his family, offer her sufficient incentive, and persuade her to acquire the service from a location considerably less well guarded. It is an elegant solution, really. Victoria arrives bearing a telegram of reconciliation. She gains access to the household, she extracts the diamonds, or failing that, she steals the service itself, and delivers them to her employers. Gerald's suspicions are aroused too late. The diamonds have vanished, and Victoria disappears once more into whatever shadows have harbored her for the past 2 years. The colonel sank back into his chair with the expression of a man watching a particularly complex and deeply troubling stage play unfold before him. "But who?" he demanded. "Who could possibly have such resources, such knowledge, such ability to track Gerald's investigations across the distance of years?" Peter turned from the window, and in his expression there was something that might have been pity, or might have been contempt, or might have been the peculiar resignation of a man who had, over the course of many years, come to understand that human nature possessed a capacity for betrayal that rendered even the most elaborate schemes almost predictable in their essential psychology. "That," he said quietly, "is what we are now going to discover, but we must proceed with considerable care. Victoria is, as I have said, a pawn, but she is a pawn with knowledge, and knowledge makes her simultaneously valuable and dangerous to whoever has set this scheme in motion. If they believe that she has succeeded, that she has secured the service or the diamonds themselves, then they will attempt to retrieve the goods and eliminate the evidence of her involvement. If they believe that she has failed, or worse, if they suspect that she has been discovered, then they will move to eliminate the problem more directly." He moved toward the door with the decisive movements of a man who had arrived at the point where contemplation must be replaced by action. "I am going to require several things from you, Colonel. First, a telegram to be sent to Gerald, nothing alarming, merely a friendly inquiry about his current location and his plans for the coming week. Second, I shall need access to Victoria's room again, and I shall need it to remain undisturbed. And third, I shall require you and Mrs. Ashford to behave as though nothing whatsoever is amiss. Victoria must be treated with warmth and familial affection. She must be made to believe that her mission is progressing exactly as planned. And when she makes her move, and she will make her move because her employers will demand it, we will be positioned to observe precisely who it is that comes to collect the prize." Dinner that evening was a performance of such extraordinary civility that it might have been staged for the amusement of some particularly demanding theatrical director. Victoria Ashford appeared in the dining room at 7:30, dressed in a gown of emerald silk that spoke of considerable expense and sophisticated taste. her dark hair arranged in a manner that suggested both care and an almost theatrical attention to effect. She was, Peter observed with the part of his mind that was always attending to such details, a woman of considerable beauty of a particular kind, the kind that speaks of intelligence and will rather than mere conventional prettiness, and the kind that carried within it an undercurrent of desperation carefully masked by social accomplishment. The Colonel and Mrs. Ashford greeted her with a warmth that, to anyone unaware of the truth, would have appeared entirely natural. Mrs. Ashford had even managed to produce a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, a feat of considerable courage given the circumstances. Peter, who had been introduced merely as a friend of the family visiting on a matter of minor business, observed the entire tableau with the attention of a man conducting some form of complex psychological autopsy. Conversation proceeded along lines of determined banality: the weather, the journey from London, the prospects for Christmas at the Manor. Victoria participated with a fluency that suggested considerable practice in the arts of social dissimulation, but Peter detected in her responses a certain mechanical quality, as though she were reciting lines that had been provided to her and had not yet become entirely natural upon her tongue. When Mrs. Ashford mentioned, with careful casualness, that she had been engaged in her annual washing of the wedding service, Victoria's fork paused for only the briefest moment before continuing its journey to her mouth. But that pause was sufficient. Peter noted it with the precision of a man reading text in a language he had spent years perfecting. After dinner, the Colonel excused himself to his study on the pretext of correspondence, whilst Mrs. Ashford suggested that Victoria might appreciate an early evening, as travel was fatiguing. Victoria, however, expressed a desire to take a turn about the drawing-room, and Peter, having been given a barely perceptible nod by Mrs. Ashford, seized the opportunity to engage her in conversation about matters of art and antiquity, a topic upon which he possessed sufficient expertise to appear knowledgeable whilst simultaneously extracting information through the simple expedient of allowing her to demonstrate her own knowledge. What emerged from this conversation, conducted with the easy grace of two people with shared interests, was that Victoria possessed a degree of education and refinement that seemed at odds with the portrait of a young woman who had, according to her estranged aunt, descended into disreputable pursuits. She spoke with authority about porcelain, about the methods of 18th-century manufacture, about the subtle variations in glaze that distinguished authentic Wedgwood from clever imitations. And when Peter, with apparent innocence, inquired as to how she had acquired such specialized knowledge, she hesitated only fractionally before offering an explanation that involved a position as an assistant in an antique shop in Paris, a position that was, Peter suspected, considerably less innocent than the description suggested. At 10:30, Victoria rose with expressions of fatigue and retired to her room. Peter waited until the house had settled into that particular silence that indicates sleep or the simulacrum thereof, and then made his way to Victoria's guest room with the silent movements of a man for whom stealth was a practiced art. The room was, as he had expected, in the process of being systematically emptied. The wardrobe contained only a single dress, carefully folded. The dressing table held no personal items beyond a hairbrush and a small bottle of expensive perfume. And the wooden case, when Peter opened it with the aid of a small implement from his pocket, proved to be considerably emptier than it had been that afternoon. 3 of the saucers were missing. 3 of the saucers bearing diamonds, removed with the precision of someone who knew exactly which pieces to take and how to extract them without creating obvious damage. Peter examined the remaining saucers with a jeweler's loupe, noting that the extraction had been performed with considerable skill. The glaze had been carefully heated, the diamonds removed, and the glaze allowed to cool in a manner that left only the faintest trace of disturbance. It was the work of someone with technical knowledge and considerable patience. He descended the stairs and found the Colonel waiting in the darkened hallway, a man who had clearly been unable to sleep and had chosen instead to maintain vigil. "She's taking them," the Colonel whispered. "Dear God, she's actually doing it. She's stealing from us." "She is not stealing," Peter corrected gently, "because they do not belong to you. She is, in fact, merely retrieving what has been claimed by those who engaged her. The question now becomes one of determining who will collect the goods once they have been fully extracted. Someone will come for them, someone who has been waiting for this moment with considerable patience. And when they arrive, we shall finally understand the true nature of this affair. Peter moved toward the window that overlooked the drive, his silhouette sharp against the grey landscape beyond. "I suggest, Colonel, that you retire to your room and attempt to sleep. What is about to unfold will require all of one's faculties intact. Victoria will attempt to complete her task tomorrow. And tomorrow night, I suspect, we shall receive a visitor whose arrival will explain everything that has, until this moment, remained opaque and deeply troubling." The following morning arrived with that particular quality of grey English light that renders all things equally colourless and equally sorrowful, and with it came a telegram addressed to the Colonel, sent from London in response to Peter's inquiry of the previous evening. Gerald Ashford Hayes, it appeared, had been taken ill quite suddenly. Nothing serious, merely a bout of influenza, but sufficient to confine him to his bed and to render him incapable of conducting further investigations into his mother's collection, for at least a fortnight. Peter received this intelligence with a nod of satisfaction that suggested he had anticipated precisely this development, and immediately set about making certain telephone calls of "Hi." From the study, conversations conducted in voices barely above a whisper, and concluded with instructions that seemed to involve the positioning of certain individuals in certain locations at certain hours of the evening. Victoria, meanwhile, had emerged from her room at breakfast time with an air of deliberate casualness that fooled absolutely no one possessed of even the most rudimentary powers of observation. She had consumed her toast and marmalade with mechanical precision, exchanged pleasantries about the weather, and then, citing a desire for fresh air and exercise, had announced her intention to walk into the village. The Colonel had offered to have the motor brought round, an offer which Victoria had declined with the sort of politeness that suggested she had anticipated the offer and had prepared a response in advance. Peter had observed this entire exchange from a position of studied disinterest, appearing to be absorbed in the pages of the Times, but missing nothing of the interplay between Victoria and her relatives. When she had departed some 20 minutes later, he had folded his newspaper with care and turned to address the Ashfords with an expression that combined gravity with a certain theatrical precision. "She will not return before this evening," he had said with certainty. "She is meeting her contact. Whoever has orchestrated this affair wishes to collect the diamonds today, whilst Gerald remains incapacitated and incapable of taking steps to prevent the loss. It is elegant, really, timed with such precision that the crime becomes nearly impossible to prevent once one understands it." The Colonel had made a movement toward the telephone, but Peter had forestalled him with a raised hand. "No," he had said quietly. "We do not inform the police, not yet. Because if we do so, we will lose the opportunity to identify the true architect of this scheme. Victoria is merely a tool, and whilst I sympathize with her circumstances, her apprehension is not what interests me. What interests me is the identity of the person who has engaged her, and more particularly the motivation behind this elaborate business." And so the day had passed in a state of peculiar suspension, the Ashfords occupying themselves with the small rituals of domestic life, whilst Peter had spent the hours in Victoria's room, examining with meticulous care the contents of her luggage, the arrangement of her clothing, and most particularly the documents that she had, with the carelessness of youth, left among her personal effects. These documents, a series of letters written in a hand that was educated but not particularly distinctive, revealed a correspondence that had been conducted over the course of several months, letters that detailed a plan of considerable complexity and considerable ambition. They spoke of the family legacy, of what was owed, of rectification of historical injustice, and of compensation for decades of silence. They were signed only with a single initial "me." As evening descended upon Ashford Manor, Peter had positioned himself in the darkened library, a room that possessed a window overlooking the drive and a door that connected to the main hallway through means that rendered observation of arrivals simultaneously possible and invisible. The Colonel and Mrs. Ashford had been instructed to retire to their rooms and to remain there on pain of completely disrupting Peter's carefully orchestrated arrangements, and Victoria had, as predicted, returned as darkness fell, her face flushed and her movements possessed of a barely concealed excitement that spoke of successful completion of some crucial task. At precisely 11 o'clock, a motor car drawn up before the manor house, a vehicle of considerable quality, drive, driven by a man whose features were obscured by the darkness and the distance. But the person who emerged from that vehicle was not a stranger to Peter Wimsey, though he suspected that the revelation of her identity would prove considerably shocking to the Ashfords. It was a woman of perhaps 55 years, dressed in a coat of dark wool and wearing a hat that obscured her features in shadow. She moved up the drive with the careful steps of someone who had rehearsed this approach many times in her imagination, and when she reached the entrance to the manor, she did not employ the bell-pull but instead knocked upon the door with the particular rhythm of someone who had been given a signal in advance. Victoria opened the door. Peter could hear the murmur of conversation, could discern the passage of some object being handed from one pair of hands to another, and then the woman had turned to leave, only to pause, only to look back toward the house with an expression that, even in the darkness, Peter could identify as profound satisfaction, mingled with something considerably more dangerous. It was at that moment, with the precision of an actor entering at exactly the right moment in a carefully choreographed scene, that Peter had stepped from the library into the hallway and, with movements that were both deliberate and swift, had positioned himself between Victoria and her contact, his voice cutting through the darkness with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood," he had said, addressing the woman with a courtesy that was entirely devoid of warmth, "I believe we have business to discuss, particularly regarding your relationship to the Ashford family, your knowledge of certain diamonds, and your rather creative interpretation of the concept of what is owed." The woman who stood in the doorway of Ashford Manor, caught between the darkness outside and the dim light of the hallway, underwent a visible transformation, her carefully maintained composure fragmenting like poorly tempered glass, revealing beneath it a landscape of emotion that had been held in abeyance for far too long. She did not attempt to flee, nor did she attempt to deny the accusation. Instead, she simply stood motionless, her gloved hand still extended in the act of taking the packet that Victoria had prepared, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the flat quality of someone for whom the elaborate machinery of deception had suddenly become too burdensome to maintain. "How did you know?" she asked, and there was in the question no anger, merely a kind of exhausted curiosity, as though she had long since ceased to care about the practical consequences of discovery and was concerned only with understanding the mechanism by which her carefully orchestrated plan had been penetrated. Peter gestured for both women to move into the drawing-room, where lamps had been lit against the encroaching darkness, and where the Colonel and Mrs. Ashford had been summoned by the bell-pull, with the understanding that discretion regarding what was about to unfold would be considerably less important than comprehension. Eleanor Blackwood removed her hat as she entered the room, revealing a face that was still handsome despite the ravages of time and evident hardship, a face that bore a superficial resemblance to the Colonel that would have been immediately apparent to anyone possessed of even moderate powers of observation. "You are the sister of the Colonel's late mother," Peter said, settling himself into a chair with the ease of a man for whom comfort had become a secondary consideration and clarity a paramount one. "Born Eleanor Marchmont, you became Eleanor Blackwood upon your marriage to a man involved in the gem trade, a trade that, I suspect, involved considerably more than the legitimate buying and selling of precious stones. When your marriage dissolved, as such marriages tend to do when they are founded upon shared criminality rather than shared affection, you disappeared into the continent, where you remained for the better part of 30 years, nursing a grievance that grew more elaborate and more elaborate with each passing year." Eleanor Blackwood sank into a chair without being invited to do so, and her hands, Peter observed, trembled slightly as they came to rest in her lap. Victoria had positioned herself near the door, her expression one of confusion mingled with a growing comprehension of the magnitude of her own entanglement. The colonel stood by the fireplace, his face a mask of shock, barely concealing dawning understanding. "My mother," Peter continued, "your sister, Margaret Ashford, married well. She married a man of considerable wealth and considerable position, and when her marriage produced a child, your nephew Gerald, she made certain arrangements that involved the concealment of certain assets, the smuggling of certain diamonds, the creation of a hidden inheritance that would remain secret until such time as circumstances rendered secrecy no longer possible. She did this, I suspect, not out of greed but out of guilt. She had money. Your husband did not. She had legitimacy. He did not. And when the inevitable scandal came, when your husband's activities became known to the authorities, she could not save him. But she could save you. She could provide you with resources, with options, with a way out of the wreckage that your marriage had created." Eleanor Blackwood's face had gone very pale, and when she spoke, her voice emerged barely above a whisper. "She told me she was sending me a wedding gift, to you and the colonel. She said it was a final reconciliation, that. She wanted to heal the breach that my marriage had caused in the family. She said that if anything ever happened to her, if I ever found myself in genuine need, I was to retrieve the diamonds and use them. She said they were mine, that they had always been meant for me. And yet," Peter said with quiet precision, "you did not attempt to retrieve them until very recently. You waited 30 years. You waited until your own circumstances had become sufficiently dire that the promise of wealth became irresistible. And you waited until you learned, through means I do not yet fully understand but can readily imagine, that Gerald was beginning to investigate his mother's collection and would inevitably discover the truth." Eleanor Blackwood rose from her chair with sudden violence, her composure shattering entirely. "Do you have any idea what it is to live as I have lived?" she demanded, her voice now carrying the raw edge of genuine anguish. "To be cast out by one's own family, to be reduced to circumstances of such degradation that one must take employment in the very establishments one's husband had frequented before his arrest, to see one's sister's child inherit everything, whilst one survives on the charity of distant acquaintances and the slowly dwindling resources of a woman who had promised to remember, but who, in the end, proved as forgetful as all the rest." "No," Peter said simply, "I do not. But that is not entirely relevant to the matter at hand, is it? Your sister made you a promise, and she kept that promise by embedding diamonds in a wedding service. But by doing so, she also created a situation of considerable moral and legal complexity. Those diamonds were, as I suspected from the beginning, proceeds from activities that were not entirely legitimate. Their retrieval does not constitute the claiming of a rightful inheritance, but rather the recovery of stolen goods, and your attempt to acquire them through the engagement of a desperate young woman whose estrangement from her family rendered her vulnerable to precisely such manipulation has transformed what might have been merely a matter of restoring stolen property into something considerably more serious." Eleanor Blackwood sank back into her chair, and all the anger seemed to drain from her as suddenly as it had appeared. "What will happen now?" she asked, with the resignation of someone who had always known, in some profound and ineradicable part of herself, that this moment would eventually arrive. "Now," Peter said, rising to his feet and retrieving from Victoria's trembling hands the packet containing the diamonds. "We shall contact Scotland Yard and explain a rather complex situation involving the recovery of stolen property, the attempted theft of items of historical and legal significance, and the engagement of a minor in criminal activity. The police will determine whether prosecution is warranted. But before we do so, I believe the colonel deserves a full explanation of precisely who his aunt was and what his inheritance truly represents. The woman who stood in the doorway of Ashford Manor, caught between the darkness outside and the dim light of the hallway, underwent a visible transformation, her carefully maintained composure fragmenting like poorly tempered glass, revealing beneath it a landscape of emotion that had been held in abeyance for far too long. She did not attempt to flee, nor did she attempt to deny the accusation. Instead, she simply stood motionless, her gloved hand still extended in the act of taking the packet that Victoria had prepared. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the flat quality of someone for whom the elaborate machinery of deception had suddenly become too burdensome to maintain. "How did you know?" she asked. "Ed," and there was in the question no anger, merely a kind of exhausted curiosity, as though she had long since ceased to care about the practical consequences of discovery, and was concerned only with understanding the mechanism by which her carefully orchestrated plan had been penetrated. Peter gestured for both women to move into the drawing room, where lamps had been lit against the encroaching darkness, and where the Colonel and Mrs. Ashford had been summoned by the bell pull with the understanding that discretion regarding what was about to unfold would be considerably less important than comprehension. Eleanor Blackwood removed her hat as she entered the room, revealing a face that was still handsome, despite the ravages of time and evident hardship. A face that bore a superficial resemblance to the Colonel that would have been immediately apparent to anyone possessed of even moderate powers of observation. "You are the sister of the Colonel's late mother," Peter said, settling himself into a chair with the ease of a man for whom comfort had become a secondary consideration and clarity a paramount one. "Born Eleanor Marchmont, you became Eleanor Blackwood upon your marriage to a man involved in the gem trade, a trade that, I suspect, involved considerably more than the legitimate buying and selling of precious stones. When your marriage dissolved, as such marriages tend to do when they are founded upon shared criminality rather than shared affection, you disappeared into the continent, where you remained for the better part of 30 years, nursing a grievance that grew more elaborate and more elaborate with each passing year." Eleanor Blackwood sank into a chair without being invited to do so, and her hands, Peter observed, trembled slightly as they came to rest in her lap. Victoria had positioned herself near the door, her expression one of confusion mingled why, a growing comprehension of the magnitude of her own entanglement. The Colonel stood by the fireplace, his face a mask of shock barely concealing dawning understanding. "My mother," Peter continued, "your sister, Margaret Ashford, married well. She married a man of considerable wealth and considerable position, and when her marriage produced a child, your nephew Gerald, she made certain arrangements that involved the concealment of certain assets, the smuggling of certain diamonds, the creation of a hidden inheritance that would remain secret until such time as circumstances rendered secrecy no longer possible. She did this, I suspect, not out of greed, but out of guilt. She had money. Your husband did not. She had legitimacy. He did not. And when the inevitable scandal came, when your husband's activities became known to the authorities, she could not save him. But she could save you. She could provide you with resources, with options, with a way out of the wreckage that your marriage had created." Eleanor Blackwood's face had gone very pale, and when she spoke, her voice emerged barely above a whisper. "She told me she was sending me a wedding gift. To you and the Colonel. She said it was a final reconciliation. That she wanted to heal the breach that my marriage had caused in the family. She said that if anything ever happened to her, if I ever found myself in genuine need, I was to retrieve the diamonds and use them. She said they were mine, that they had always been meant for me. And yet," Peter said with quiet precision, "you did not attempt to retrieve them until very recently. You waited 30 years. You waited until your own circumstances had become sufficiently dire that the promise of wealth became irresistible. And you waited until you learned, through means I do not yet fully understand, but can readily imagine, that Gerald was beginning to investigate his mother's collection and would inevitably discover the truth." Eleanor Blackwood rose from her chair with sudden violence, her composure shattering entirely. "Do you have any idea what it is to live as I have lived?" she demanded, her voice now carrying the raw edge of genuine anguish. "To be cast out by one's own family, to be reduced to circumstances of such degradation that one must take employment in the very establishments one's husband had frequented before his arrest, to see one's sister's child inherit everything, whilst one survives on the charity of distant acquaintances and the slowly dwindling resources of a woman who had promised to remember, but who, in the end, proved as forgetful as all the rest? No, Peter said simply, I do not. But that is not entirely relevant to the matter at hand, is it? Your sister made you a promise, and she kept that promise by embedding diamonds in a wedding service. But by doing so, she also created a situation of considerable moral and legal complexity. Those diamonds were, as I suspected from the beginning, proceeds from activities that were not entirely legitimate. Their retrieval does not constitute the claiming of a rightful inheritance, but rather the recovery of stolen goods. And your attempt to acquire them through the engagement of a desperate young woman whose estrangement from her family rendered her vulnerable to precisely such manipulation has transformed what might have been merely a matter of restoring stolen property into something considerably more serious. Eleanor Blackwood sank back into her chair, and all the anger seemed to drain from her as suddenly as it had appeared. What will happen now? She asked, with the resignation of someone who had always known, in some profound and ineradicable part of herself, that this moment would eventually arrive. Now, Peter said, rising to his feet and retrieving from Victoria's trembling hands the packet containing the diamonds, we shall contact Scotland Yard and explain a rather complex situation involving the recovery of stolen property, the attempted theft of items of historical and legal significance, and the engagement of a minor in criminal activity. The police will determine whether prosecution is warranted, but before we do so, I believe the Colonel deserves a full explanation of precisely who his aunt was and what his inheritance truly represents.